Tony Reeves.
Hi.
Hello. You worked for Gay News in the 1970s and early 80s. Can you tell us anything about your memories pre-1967 and the Sexual Offences Act?
Yes, it was before the Sexual Offences Act. The major difference in time was not so much the illegality, it's the fact that nobody was able to come out. So I was about 17 when it was decriminalised. So up until that point, there couldn't be any organisations, newspapers, or any kind of political voice. Nobody was out, obviously, because it was totally illegal. And once it was decriminalised, there was no sudden rush of people coming out. It took a long, long time for people to start sort of popping their head out. The whole idea of decriminalising gay sex was that society would be sort of self-policing. The whole shame and stigma attached to being gay would be enough to keep people secret and furtive and in their place. So it took a while for people to think to themselves that, hey, we can actually come out and announce ourselves and be, damn it, if it's not legal, what are we faffing about with? So I think I wasn't in London then, I was in the Midlands, in Stoke then, and so we didn't see the first of the Gay Liberation Front, which I think would have been around 71 in London, and it didn't really make the pages of the Daily Express in those days. But I did see a copy of Gay News, about the 6th or 7th issue, hanging up on a newsstand in Newcastle-under-Lyme, and it was just amazing seeing something with the word gay on an ordinary newspaper stand in the street.
The mainstream press, if there was a story about gay issues, what would the subject matter usually be?
It would only be mentioned when somebody famous was caught with a guardsman in the bushes or was arrested in a toilet. They were the only time anybody's sexuality was referred to. A couple of high-profile cases of famous people who were caught doing something. That's the only thing you ever read about. They did do I do remember an expose. This was a little later of Earl's Court. I think it was the News of the World or the People, with a photograph of Old Brompton Road saying, "Is this the wickedest street in the world?" And there's a photograph, and in the photograph you see the florist, the laundrette, the leather goods store, and well as wicked streets go, maybe not. But that was the kind of the tone of the press stuff when they were exposing the twilight world of the homosexual, or people with the eyes blanked out.
You were brought up in Stoke.
Yeah.
When did you move to London exactly?
The end of 1973.
And had you been involved with the GLF in Stoke at all, or the campaign for homosexual equality?
Sort of, kind of on the fringes. I just discovered, I saw an advert in the local paper just once, tiny little classified ad saying Gay Liberation Front meeting. This was back June 72, and I was amazed. I immediately rushed down to the pub and found this little back room, and there was a bunch of students from Keele University. And it turned out to be the last night of term, and they were all graduating that year, so it was the last meeting. When the term started in the next year, I sort of sidled in and turned up. I'd been a student, so I felt fairly entitled, and set up a table at the Freshers' Corridor and tried to start a new GLF branch at Keele, but there wasn't a lot of support, so it didn't really take off.
You first saw Gay News, a copy of it in Newcastle-under-Lyme.
Yeah.
Did you find, others I've spoken to found, even among gay people, there was a certain snobbery towards it? We don't want our homosexuality politicised. We don't want it all out there. Did you experience that at all?
Oh yes. There was. Yes, people felt very threatened by gay politics in general. I think there was a feeling that a fear of a backlash, that so long as we remained very quiet and behaved ourselves and tucked away and clubs and pubs with the doors locked and the curtains pulled, we would be safe. But if we started making a noise and becoming political and come out, we'd draw down the wrath of heterosexuals, and terrible things would happen. So there was quite a bit of antipathy towards gay politics and the gay press.
The early 70s were a time of change in London. Do you remember what the scene was like at all? The gay bars, the clubs?
Yes. Yeah, there was very little in the West End in those days, which is odd now when you consider how Soho is the centre of everything. There were a few sort of long-serving gentlemen's clubs, which people of my age of youth now didn't really go to. I think they were. It was a lot of men who'd come out of the army, people who'd been in Enser, and ex-army drag queens and entertainment. I think they'd set up various gentlemen's private clubs in the West End, but mainly it was around Earl's Court and a couple of things in Chelsea. So the main pub in London was the Boltons, which is at the top end of Earl's Court Road, which I think is now O'Reilly's is an Irish themed pub. And that was the main pub in London. And across the road from it was the famous Coleherne, which in those days took the overflow from the Boltons and the little, then quite little leather crowd, your caps and jackets. But the Boltons became very sleazy and went downhill, and eventually closed, and everybody moved across. The Coleherne became the major pub. Around the corner there was the Catacombs, which was a little coffee club, which had a tiny dance floor, and like the Catacombs, it was brick walls with little arches, with little cubby holes inside where you could just about squeeze round the table and have a cup of coffee and one of the legendary toasted cheese sandwiches, which was the highlight of the evening in those days.
Did you get copies of gay news in those bars at all?
Occasionally somebody would come around and sell them, because in the early days the staff of the paper themselves would go around. Well, Denis himself would sometimes. Denis Lemon, the editor, would actually sometimes go around with a pouch and he'd go to the Coleherne and try and sell them. But there wasn't a very warm welcome generally, I think, for
really?
The newspaper on the gay scene.
Were people embarrassed by it, or?
Yeah, and there was that, antipathy to we've come out for a night to have fun and things. We don't want anything like news or the real world to intrude on it. So it's.
So how did you get involved with gay news yourself, and what year would that have been?
That was just after I'd moved to London, about 1974. I mean, I wasn't a trained artist. I mean, I'd done physics and chemistry at university, but I've always drawn as a sideline, and I did pen and ink drawings, which were very well suited to reproduction in newsprint. And I was familiar with gay news. I started to buy it as soon as I saw it in Stoke and bought it regularly. And I just sent some of my drawings off to them one day. And they published one, and I was sort of commissioned to regularly illustrate articles.
How did you feel when they published your first illustration?
Absolutely thrilled, The first time I saw something of mine published, opened it up and saw they'd used my drawing as well.
Who was it who took you on? Was it Denis Lemon?
It was Denis Lemon himself, yeah.
And you didn't have an interview or anything like that?
No, but it was just a sort of freelance position. I was just, and because I started to do some work for other magazines like Him and so on, and Gay News sort of wanted to keep, because I got a very specific style and they wanted to keep it pretty much there, so they put me on a retainer, so that I just worked just did my illustrations for Gay News.
Did you have any favourite illustrations for Gay News that you did?
No, I'm really embarrassed by them all.
Oh, no.
Looking back on them,
No.
because they changed over the years, and I was learning. I gradually learned what worked and what didn't work by trial and error. Because I wasn't trained. I didn't come in with a background in art, knowing exactly what to do. So I learned by looking at things, saying, "Oh God, that didn't work." Did it? But what would happen? I'd be given a shape, because the page would be laid out in those pre-computer days. The page would be laid out with a hole, which could be either a square or sometimes it's just ragged edges of of the copy, and I'd have to fit an illustration in. So it was a nice technical challenge fitting an illustration into the pre-existing layout.
Where did you get your ideas from for the illustrations?
It's just very much from the articles that I'd get a copy of the article beforehand to and read it. So you'd kind of try and tie it in with the style, whether it's something academic or just something kind of whimsical or political.
What's the secret then to being a good illustrator? Is there one?
No, I think it's being very practical, not too arty-farty, knowing what works in print and what doesn't, what will work with the text, and kind of counterpoint the text rather than just straightforwardly illustrating what's already being said. And meeting deadlines is the main thing, working to a very tight deadline.
I mean, there were a lot of members of staff at Gay News. I think at one point there was something like between 16 to 22 or 23 staff. There was one toilet for the staff, and I think Denis Lemon had his own.
Yes.
And you had people who were academics, you had people who'd left school at 16. You yourself were an illustrator, but you had people like Alison Hennigan, Keith Howes, Michael Mason, who were doing features and news. What was it like working in that melting pot?
It was very exciting because there was such a mix, and I was very much in awe of those people, so Michael, Alison and Keith, because they seemed so incredibly well educated and they could write and express themselves articulately. So it was a bit daunting, and of course there was JC and Glenn Jean-Claude, who were the senior designers on the paper that I worked alongside, and of course they were both trained artists, so I was very much the learner and the beginner. And
did everybody get on quite well, or was there politics in the office?
Originally there was, because we had such a common goal, although there were some very different personalities. And there was always a kind of creative clash between people who wanted more of a serious newspaper, and some people wanted it more light, friendly, magazine-y. But I think that tension sort of worked because they balanced each other out. It never got too serious that it wasn't approachable, but never got too lightweight.
If you look at the covers, some of them are quite magazine-y, as you call it, and some are quite newsy. And sometimes it's hard to always know, is this a newspaper or is this a magazine?
Yeah, I think it depends on the age. The very, very first ones, the very early ones, 1, 2, 3 and 4, were very magazine-y. And then they became much more newsy, very, very, looked like the Times or something, some of them. And then later on it went back and became more, more design-led again, just for the front covers.
There were a couple of controversies with Gay News. I think the first was around 1974, when Gay News was prosecuted for obscenity laws. I think there were 2 men kissing on the front cover. Do you remember that at all? Yeah,
that was before I was working for it. I don't know if there's a prosecution. I think they were warned, but what I remember was the cover was a collage. It was 2 naked men, not really showing anything everywhere. But as I remember, they had the heads of Cliff Richard and Lord Longford had been superimposed on the bodies. I can't quite remember the reason behind it.
Well, no action, as far as I know. They weren't successfully prosecuted or anything.
No, I don't think there was an actual prosecution. I think there was a serious warning that you do not do things like this or you will meet so.
But a couple of years later, there was the famous James Kirkup poem,
yes.
And you were involved because you wrote the illustration that went with it, and there was a successful prosecution.
That was a prosecution.
From Mary Whitehouse and her friends.
Yeah.
Can you remember much about that?
Yes, it was very much a surprise. Nobody expected that kind of response. I mean, we really didn't. It wasn't a big deal when we published it. I know some people said, "Oh, you did it to publicity," whereas it was a poem by an academic, tucked away 3/4 of the way through the magazine alongside the classical music reviews, so it's hardly a high-profile, provocative thing. But I remember Denis handing me the poem to read, and he sort of had a slight impish reading about it, saying this'll this will wind up the gay Christians. Meaning, I think, the people who wrote, because gay Christians had their own column in the paper. It's called Our God Too, as I remember it. So I think it was that kind of controversy he was hoping to stir up, that the next issue would have the gay Christians saying, "Oh, how dare you do this, and this is deeply offensive to us who believe."
Do you think he ever imagined it would lead to a prosecution?
No, not at all.
Did you at all?
No, never entered our heads at all.
And when you did your cartoon, your illustration but went with it, did you ever think this could get me into trouble?
Yes. Because it was that difficult thing, because the poem was obviously very provocative, and deliberately so. And to do a really coy illustration, I thought would have been betraying the poem. So I had to do something, and it described the naked body of Christ as young, beardless, and well hung. Well, I have to illustrate this. I can't be terribly coy about it. I did one version that I did get cold feet over at the last minute, and I dumped it and redrew it very quickly, which is why the illustration that went in is one of the worst ever.
Was it a lot less explicit?
It was. There was less emphasis on the figures and a lot more drapery to fill up the space.
What was the reaction then in Gay News when Denis found out he and his publication were going to be prosecuted?
Disbelief, really. I think the initial one. It was 6 months after. Now this was it was a fortnightly newspaper, a small circulation. So you'd imagine 3 weeks after something had come out, it was totally forgotten. There'd been letters from Christians and then letters from humanists proposed. That had died down months ago, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, this prosecution truck suddenly appeared. I walked into the office with a new illustration to hand in, and everybody was jokingly saying, "Oh, it's all your fault for drawing naked Jesus." And I was, what's going on? And I said,
You were to blame.
Yeah, we're being prosecuted by Mary Whitehouse. And I thought this was a complete joke. I didn't believe it was real, that anybody could take that so seriously. And the idea it was something that happened so long ago. I think if there'd been a genuine concern saying, we've got to nip this in the bud, these people are going too far, a letter could have been sent to the editor saying, you realise this is potentially blasphemous, and we'll be keeping an eye on this to see nothing like this ever happens again, as had happened with the Lord Longford collage case. Would have sufficed. It would have made us a bit nervous about doing anything like that. The fact that it was actually a prosecution seemed deliberately vindictive. I think they had the feeling that Whitehouse had been watching the paper and was looking for any kind of excuse, anything where we'd crossed the line, that illegality had come into it. Because we had to be very, very careful about things like classified ads, because you couldn't solicit, as it was called, for sex in those days, and the age of consent was 21, so every advert had to have brackets over 21. And it always had to say for friendship. You could not imply there was anything sexual, so there were lots of people looking for over 21 friends.
As you do.
In the paper. So we were always being very careful to try and stay within the law.
Was there ever a feeling that the prosecution would be successful?
We genuinely didn't know. It was such unknown territory. There hadn't been a prosecution for blasphemy since the 1920s. And it seems such a bizarre thing. If we were being done for obscenity or something like that, but blasphemy felt so. We were just going totally into the unknown. And I think naively, I think the defence was prepared to counter the charge of blasphemy, which, of course, with hindsight, was never ever going to be the issue. It was just that it was, rude, disgusting, and shocking, and I don't think anybody was interested in the divine implications, or whether or not it was challenging, the inherent holiness of Christ or anything. I think, as I remember, I think there were a few expert theological witnesses to testify that in fact this was not technically blasphemous, as it never actually challenged the notion of Jesus Christ as being the Son of God. It was a way of rewriting the sort of the Mass, where the usual imagery is of eating a dead body and drinking blood, which would probably be quite shocking to somebody outside our culture who was not familiar with it. And by replacing that with the metaphor of sex instead of a metaphor of eating, was just to sort of stir things up and show how shocking this imagery could be. And I think they fell for that sort of thing, and describing it as being a poem about Jesus having sex and the apostles having sex with Christ is exactly the same thing as taking something so literally as people describing Christianity want to eat dead bodies and drink blood. They couldn't see that this was the whole point was it was just taking a metaphor and showing how difficult it would be if you made the metaphor sexual in our culture.
You attended the court case, didn't you? What was it like? What are the things you remember particularly?
I had to queue up to go in the watch it from the public gallery, because although it was the poem and the illustration was cited, it was only the editor, the person who published the poem, that was charged. So the poet, James Kirkup, the poet, and myself, who did the illustration, were not really anything to do with the case. So Denis Lemon was pretty much on his own in the dock. Although Mary Whitehouse always claimed that the prosecution was taken over by the Crown, and she would always say, "Oh, it's nothing to do with me. I just started the ball rolling, and they took it over." Yet she was given a seat in the well of the court every day, so it wasn't entirely impartial. It was quite a strange, surreal experience watching the trial. We were being defended by John Mortimer, the playwright who invented Rumpole of the Bailey, who liked to take on these cases of free speech, because I think about the same time he'd taken on the Sex Pistols' Never Mind the Bollocks album cover as well. And we had a judge called Alan King Hamilton, who made it very plain from the start where his sympathies lay, and they were not with the newspaper.
So you felt there was an inbuilt bias?
Very much so. I felt he was constantly nudging and herding the jury, rather like treating them rather like sheep and giving them instructions, sending them this way and that.
Didn't he do things like give the cricket scores?
He did. He would do things like John Mortimer, of course, would use his wit, very pointed wit, to make a point. And of course, the King Hamilton would immediately step in and say, "This is a very serious affair. We're not here to make jokes," to try and trample on his witty points. And yet, then in the middle of the afternoon, sort of stop the proceedings to know that we might like to hear the latest cricket scores.
Sure, you were riveted.
Yes, I think that said something about the old school establishment attitude of the courts then. And
was there much hostility in the court from the mainstream press who were there to report it?
No, I don't think there's a great deal of hostility. There's more bemusement. It was such a strange case, and Mary Whitehouse was not a loved figure by the press generally, so I don't think we got a really bad press out of it. I think there was a strange bemusement of this. Okay, yes, it was they agreed, yes, a shocking, disgusting poem, but Mary Whitehouse is a bit eccentric, and blasphemy is such a... But it did give rise to some wonderfully surreal moments. My favourite was seeing a photocopy of my drawing being waved about by the prosecutions. It was a red-faced young man with all the blather of an aggressive upper-class prosecutor. After going through the poem line by line and expressing his disgust with every line of it, and then a good illustration, and he waved this photocopy around in court, and he just came out with this line which I absolutely adore. And if I've achieved one thing in my life, it was to have this line spoken in the main criminal court at the Old Bailey. He waved the paper about and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, will you look at the state of Christ's penis?"
Brilliant, priceless. That is priceless.
I thought I will have that carved on my tombstone.
I was going to say. I heard that, of course, Denis was found guilty, as was Gay News. Yeah. What damage did it do to Denis? How did he feel?
I think it affected him a lot. I knew him quite well, but not really personally to talk to him. But I found him very, very distant after the case. I think it was a huge strain on him, being on his own in the dock. The charges were against the newspaper as a company and the editor, but he was the sole person having to take the responsibility. And there were serious consequences. I mean, when the judge rang out, I think a year's sentence, suspended. But he gave a long theatrical pause between the sentence, and everybody held their breath. He said, but suspended for 12 months, which was...
quite a relief.
Yes, but it just felt like digging the knife in a little.
What had Denis been like before the trial? In the years or the period that you'd worked with him?
He was very much a hands-on editor. I think people who were more experienced and confident and had their own ideas found him quite difficult to work with or under. Very strong ideas, and he would always be over your shoulder pointing things out that you'd already seen. But for somebody like me who was starting out, I admired him. I liked that. It taught me a lot. It taught me to be very, very nitpicky and careful and have an eye for detail, and knowing that if I got the slightest thing wrong, Denis would be there breathing down my neck. But I think people who already had those standards and sort of resented it. But I think he did provide a really strong energy and drive to the paper and was a huge force behind it. But after the case, he seemed more withdrawn. I think I've heard from other people now that it was strain and he didn't like the publicity. At the time, I was sort of feeling that maybe he joined the establishment because he joined the Reform Club.
Wasn't he courted by Private Eye and people like that? He became a minor celebrity.
Yes, he did, and there was much more suit and tie and became a public
Do you think it
figure.
went to his head at all, or was that an illusion?
I thought it did at the time, but I would have second thoughts about it with hindsight. I think it maybe was a defence mechanism.
It was a front.
Feeling so vulnerable and so threatened, and having taken so much on.
Because he also appealed, didn't he?
Yes.
And they were not successful. I think he had his suspended sentence removed, but there was still a heavy fine, if I remember rightly.
But there was a Gay News fighting fund that Badgers made.
Because of course the readership went up.
Oh yeah,
quite a bit, didn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean, as people say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. No. It was a shot in the arm for the paper. It had entirely the opposite effect that the White House had intended. I think the idea had been to close the paper down, which would have fragmented the gay movement, because it was the central forum, virtually the only serious forum for gay people in the country. Up till then, you just had separate little bars, cliques here and there. Nobody could share ideas, nobody could be organised, nobody could say, let's have a demonstration for people all over the country. Nobody could say, what do you think about coming out? There was no concept of coming out. And one of the running debates in the early issues of Gay News was the idea of coming out. And there was this huge backlash against it, and the debate was about rocking the boat. And the thing was, don't rock the boat, don't rock the boat, was this chorus that you heard, and coming out, or as Aaron said, just being open about who you are, was seen as something very radical and shocking, and we were accused of flaunting it and shouting it from the rooftops.
Because a lot of gay people didn't like that, didn't I? Remember hearing that outside the Coleherne once there's a pride march, gay pride march, and some of the customers were throwing things at the marchers saying, like, you're politicising our lives, we don't want that.
Yes, there was one march that went from Sloane Square to Earls Court to go through ghetto land, and it was a tiny march. It was late 70s, early 80s. very sad, bedraggled little trail on us, and I thought this was going to be the last gay pride ever. I thought it would run out of steam, and this was it. You know, we sort of zigzagged through the streets of South Kensington to Earl's Court. I went past the Coleherne, which was my local pub in those days, and so it was very disappointing. The doors were open because it was afternoon, it was very dark inside, so you could just see these dark open doors, and there were just a couple of cans and bottles came out, and that was the kind of greeting. I think it's been exaggerated in some versions. There's
quite
been a hail of bottle and things. It was just a game, and a bit of abuse, because it was a, you know, it was seen as a threat to people who were saying it was a thing of, you know, you're rocking the boat, you're going to cause more trouble for us with all this politicising of being gay, and which I can never understand. You know, if I were a little badge, I should put a badge saying I was gay, which is terribly embarrassing. But it meant I didn't have to broach the subject. I didn't have to shout about it. It had all the embarrassment out, and it was there, and people would have a go at you. And I thought, well, you would never say something like that to somebody wearing a heterosexual wearing a wedding ring. You wouldn't say, "My God, I don't want to know what you do in bed at night in the bedroom. That's disgusting." And that, you know, what? It's not saying anything about.
Did the gay news trial though play a role in the closure and collapse of gay news a few years later?
No, I don't think it really had in, because this was gay news started in June '72. The poem was published in '76. After 4 years, the trial was 77. So the gay news was 5 years old. Well, it lived to be nearly 11 years old. So the trial was in the first half of its existence, and it went on to be actually much more successful.
When did you first get an inkling that something was wrong with gay news, or was going to close imminently?
That it was going to close, no idea. That there were troubles. Yeah, Denis Lemon left very suddenly over the Christmas New Year holiday of 81, 82. Because after the trial, he was very exhausted, worn out. And he took a bit of a sabbatical and went to West Coast San Francisco for, I think it was about a year, and became ill, which is something we didn't realise at the time. I mean, we knew he'd become ill with something, but we didn't know anything about AIDS, HIV in those days. He came back and his energy was totally gone. He was worn out.
Do you know why he left suddenly? You said he left suddenly.
Yeah, it took us a long while to find out. We came back in January, and the paper had been bought by its marketing manager, Robert Palmer, and Denis was just gone. There'd been no goodbye, no hint of him going, no leaving do, which seemed absolutely extraordinary. And we had a new owner who I think had more commercial values. He'd been the marketing manager, so we were very wary that he wanted to turn this round and turn it from a newspaper into something much more flashy and commercial. We went along with it. There was an initial sort of burst of optimism. Without Denis there, I think people suddenly felt freed up a lot. A lot of people who could bring their own ideas. And so we got the visible lesbian spread, and there were women on the paper who could have a space of their own, which was it just sort of been discussed, but there was always this feeling that once you put a woman's page in, it takes the onus off the rest of the paper to take any notice of women at all.
Because there'd been a feeling among some people that lesbians and women had been ignored.
Yeah.
And it was very much, obviously most of the staff were men, etc.
Yeah.
And they had to bring the visible lesbian.
Yeah.
But they were also worried that could be a bit of tokenism as well.
Yes, exactly. So everything would just be funneled into this one thing. But again, as the lesser of two evils, they decided that the women wanted this space, so they had a 2-page spread out of a 64-page newspaper, which is the legendary lesbian takeover of the magazine, as some people have called it.
So what were the reasons for its collapse?
We talked about it for a few months. We were doing feeling we were doing well, and then Robert Palmer invited us round to his place to give us a seminar on finances and cash flow, just to basically reassure us that although we were, as you would, had to pull our horns in, tighten our belts, and all these wonderful metaphors, that there was no actual problem, that these things happen, it's cash flow, it's a business thing that we wouldn't understand. He explained with flow charts why we need to do it, but there was nothing to worry about. And then about a week later, about a third of the staff got redundancy notices. Just absolutely out of the blue. Absolutely.
Must be pretty shocking.
Very, very, very shocking. And some people were put on part-time working.
Were these the journalists, or were they typesetters? Was it a broad range?
I think we felt at the time it was heavily on the production side.
Really?
The writers, we felt that the sort of office staff got off fairly lightly, and we felt there was that in some way we could manage with fewer writers, fewer designers.
That would put a lot more pressure on people.
Yeah, and felt that the women were unfairly represented in the sackings as well, was the feeling. So there was enormous resentment, and we wanted to know what was behind it, what was the cause of these financial problems, because we couldn't believe there was a sudden drop off of sales or advertising, and it took us a long time to find out. When the NUJ was brought in, and there was endless wrangling, and we felt it was all something to do with the sale. Denis had sold the paper to Robert Palmer.
It was done quite secretly, wasn't it?
Totally secret, yeah. We knew nothing about the terms of that, and that's what we wanted to know, was what were the terms of the sale. Has that got any bearing on people losing their jobs? And we were constantly stonewalled, saying, this is just a business deal between two men, it's nothing to do with you. And I think we rightly thought, well, it's losing people's jobs, it is something to do with us. And I think when it came out, that was pretty much the case, that the way the paper had been sold had left it in a financially dubious position, that it could not pay for itself, and it owed a lot of money still to Denis. In a way, Robert was trying to buy it on an instalment scheme, and his intention was to use the profits from the paper to pay off Denis, and it wasn't generating that kind of profit. So as soon as Denis's first payment came in, we found ourselves trading illegally, and the receiver stepped in, and the paper was just closed down.
How much notice did you have?
None.
None at all?
No, we just came in, and that was it. We were trading illegally, and we just sat down stunned. So
you were unemployed?
Yeah.
Did anybody try and get hold of Denis, or to ask him what was going on, or could he save it?
There were all kinds of things tried to say. The people were talking to the old GLC in those days, trying to get funding, trying to keep the paper going as a collective, looking for backers who'd step in, because it had felt like this was an institution. We couldn't believe that there's something like this, that everybody wouldn't rally round and somehow put money in and keep it afloat. But just nothing worked out.
Was Andrew Lumsden the editor at this time?
Yes, he was. Yes.
Well, did he have a very different approach from Denis?
Yes, he was much more easygoing, I would say. And I think gave people a lot more freedom, I would say, to do what they did. He still had his very strong ideas of the paper, and fought to keep it a serious paper against the inroads of the marketing people who wanted to turn it into more of a magazine.
And although you had no notice it was closing, you said you had an inkling, you knew things were difficult during the period. Was there still motivation among the surviving staff to keep it going, or had that motivation gone?
I think most of us really wanted to keep it going. I mean, everybody was really exhausted by this time. During all this wrangling and finding out, we've been having staff meetings, there were discussions whether we should go on strike or not go on strike. And there was this, people were really torn. A lot of people thought on principle we should stop working on this, but on the other hand, we still felt this responsibility to the community. We've got to keep it coming out. There's no way you can not have it coming out. So it was really, really stressful, but everybody desperately wanted to keep the paper coming out under any circumstances.
And when it did close, shortly afterwards, there was another publication called Gay Reporter, which Denis set up with Peter Burton.
That's right.
And I remember reading that some of the former Gay News staff did a spoof edition.
Yes.
Were you involved with that at all, or either of the publications, the official or unofficial one?
Yes, we were very, feelings were running very, very, very high, and after Gay News folded, the title and the goodwill and everything was put up for auction. And it had quite a good reputation, so the price was very high. And I think Milevers, the publishers of Him magazine and Zipper and Vulcan, they would have liked it, taken the title. But it was bought up by someone who was not, who I don't think had ever been involved with publishing, and brought out a new A4 magazine called The New Gay News, which was just dreadful.
And that didn't last,
It
really?
didn't, no, just a couple of months.
What?
It died. There was no connection with the old Gay News. There were no
None
writers,
at all.
no name that we recognised. So when that went, and the Milevers tried to get another part of the equation, because there have been three parts in really of Gay News. There were the staff, Denis Lemon, the ex-editor, and the title. So when the title didn't work, they fell back on the ex-editor, and they gave him, and Peter Burton, who'd been a features editor on Gay News, a project called Gay Reporter, because they couldn't get the name Gay Times. Gay Reporter, and they brought out this, and we got wind of it. And we were because I'd been doing a regular sort of political sort of cartoon in the paper, so I kind of subscribed to a kind of private eye kind of satirical kind of humour. We had the idea of bringing out a spoof version of Gay Reporter, and we managed to get a copy of the masthead in advance, and pulled some money together and got a printers, and we sort of vaguely knew the format was going to be, so we managed to get a spoof version brought out just before the real thing.
Do you think that really got under the skin of Peter and Denis?
Denis particularly, yes. I heard that he was spitting blood. He wanted to take us to court for copyright and passing them.
I know that in the final edition of Gay Reporter, in the editorial, there's an absolute attack on those people at Gay News who had done this spoof edition.
Yeah.
So when the spoof edition was done, was it done out of comic value, out of anger?
Yeah, both.
So a bit.
Both. I mean, I know I felt very, 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 very angry, but I was used to channeling my anger into humour with doing cartoons and spoofs. So it was a great safety valve to let off all this steam in print, and it did. Once we put it together, we did have the idea of wondering if we could bring something out regularly, a sort of satirical gay magazine, but we couldn't get any funding to do it. But that would have been.
That would have been great.
I would have quite enjoyed it.
What do you think the greatest legacy of Gay News was?
That it launched the idea that you could have a serious gay newspaper, that the gay publishing didn't all have to be about reviews of pubs and clubs and these editorials that begin, oh, well, my dear, which is the way all gay stuff had been written about in the past. It was all, gossip and club reviews and gorgeous homes. That there was a market, there was a need for serious writing, serious journalism, something that could pull everybody together and make a gay community where there had just been disparate little scenes, little local pubs. And there were spin-offs like Michael Mason and Graham McCarrow went out and launched Capital Gay, which was the first free gay newspaper, and launched the idea of all the free papers that are now have come out in bars.
He was also one of the ones, I think, the first ones to mention HIV by its full name.
Yeah. I mean, what would have happened without gay news publications when HIV and AIDS? If people have been relying entirely on the straight press or the tabloid press for their information,
Yes.
what kind of state would we have been in without that. And it also, I think it influenced the straight press to take gay issues a little more seriously when they were being reported seriously, when there was in-depth stuff and genuine injustices being reported in gay news. It showed up the lack of coverage in supposedly liberal papers like The Guardian, who hadn't had much of a great track record on covering gay issues up till then.
Do you think gay news could survive in today's market?
It's very difficult. Because a lot of the campaigning points have been won. A lot of the actual physical campaigns and sort of ages of consent and recognising relationships and it's difficult to see where it would have gone without being an entertainment. An entertainment or something purely to do with gay culture, whatever that might be. So in a way it was almost going to be, ultimately it was going to be self-defeating. It would ultimately wipe itself out.
Would you still work for gay news if it was around today?
Yes.
You'd still want to?
Oh, yeah.
What do you think of then today's gay publications? Do you read them? You can be honest.
No, because I found I've drifted away from the commercial gay scene, and I think gay publications now are much more about the gay scene and gay culture. There's not we don't have the kind of imperatives. They're not. I mean, nothing's perfect. Of course, there's outside London there are still injustices, but there are not the huge, shocking injustices that people can band together and complain about anymore. So we don't have that kind of that campaigning arm isn't there anymore. There are still things like abroad. I mean, I think we've got a responsibility to other countries in Africa, America, in India, where there are shocking things going on. So I think there's still lots of campaigning to do on behalf of other people. But what happened in this country, it's very difficult to think what you would put in what was a newspaper like Gay News. Would there still be the imperative? There are still things to talk about, but would they be the same things for everybody? Would there be this mass market, like everybody was affected by the age of consent? Whereas there could be discussions on what chemicals are fashionable this week, what's happening in the scene, or what's happening over marriage. They would not affect everybody. Some people would have, it's all fragmented, some people would have an interest in this, and some people, they're not the huge issues that there were. They're not as apparently insurmountable as they once felt, that we all had this shared burden. It's like, God, what on earth are we going to do about this? This is shocking. And a lot is now covered by the mainstream press, of course, as well.
Because a lot of it's also become quite mainstream. It's a bit like a lot of the bars, gay bars. A lot of gay people now go to the mainstream bars. You've touched upon it. What do you think are the major changes socially that we've witnessed? This is one of my last questions. But we've witnessed since the closure of Gay News. In terms of changes socially and legally, in terms of attitudes.
I think probably the political attitude, the acceptability, this whole idea that there was something that was utterly beyond the pale. There was a time when homosexuality was unspeakable. I remember one of the cartoons I did, it was the chief superintendent of some major police force, I think it was somewhere up north, giving an interview about his long career, and saying in his opinion the two biggest crimes he'd had to deal with were cannabis and homosexuality. When you think of a police force dealing with rape, murder, it just showed the priorities of the establishment in those days. This was something so way beyond the pale. It was something like an infection that once these gays got out, they would corrupt all the children. And the fact that now you automatically have the leader of the Conservative Party, just taking homosexuality, equality, totally for granted, obviously, and the fact that the word homophobia is just bandied about for anybody who disagrees. And there are still lots of social changes, still lots of little social prejudice for people locally and people within families. But that's slower. That takes generations to change attitudes. But the fact that the framework has changed, that it's no longer institutionalised, is the biggest change.
What are your hopes for the future?
Just things change quickly. I'm just impatient. I'm back in 1968 or something, I couldn't see why. If it's legal now, why can't we have the same age of consent? Why can't people get married and have a relationship? Why can't we, why does it have to take 40 years for things to change? I'm just impatient. I just want everything to be done like that now. Oh, come on, it's going to happen one day. Why can't we just get on with it now? And to be able to find some way of getting through to other cultures, other countries.
So, what has Tony Reeves done since Gay News?
After about a year of Gay News ending, when I said I never wanted anything to do with gay publishing again, I joined Gay Times as designer. There were several people from the old Gay News then went along when Gay Times was launched, and Glenn Platt, who'd been the designer on Gay News with me, and we became the two designers on Gay Times, and I worked there for over 20 years working on.
How did that compare to Gay News?
It was quite different because it was far less campaigning. It was very much. It was a men's magazine. It had news values certainly, but it was a lot more a magazine and entertaining. It was aimed at them, and it was a great chance to work in technical things. We'd worked on newsprint, and it was lovely as a designer to be working in full colour and magazines. So it was a challenge, and it's something I hugely enjoyed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.